The fire had been burning since before dawn. Maisie knew this because she had lit it herself, crouching in the cold stone kitchen with her fingers still numb from the walk through the forest path, coaxing embers to life while the rest of the estate slept. That was the way of things for her. She woke before the world remembered it needed her, and she worked until the world forgot she was there. The great hall of Thornfeld Estate smelled of pine resin and melting tallow, of dried herbs hanging from the rafters and the deep, rich bass of venison stock that had simmered through the night. Maisie moved between the long preparation tables with practiced efficiency, her worn apron already dusted with flour, her dark hair pinned back under a simple cloth wrap. Her boots had a crack along the left sole that let in the cold, but she had learned to ignore it. There were worse discomforts. Today was not an ordinary day. Today was the day the Alpha King arrived. She had known for 2 weeks. The whole territory had known. The wedding preparations had consumed every capable pair of hands in 3 villages: seamstresses, stable hands, woodworkers, musicians, and cooks. Especially cooks. Maisie had been summoned from her small post in the eastern kitchens to serve as head cook for the celebration feast, a fact that had surprised everyone except herself. She was good at her work. That had never been the question. The question was why someone like her, a commoner with no pack affiliation, no family name worth mentioning, and a past she kept sealed like a jar of winter preserves, had been trusted with the most important feast the territory had seen in a generation. The answer, she suspected, was simpler than anyone wanted to admit. She was reliable. She did not gossip. She did not steal. And she could make a roasted root soup that had once made a grieving elder weep with something that was not sadness. She ladled a portion of the stock into a small clay cup and sipped it slowly, eyes closed, tasting. More bay. A touch of smoked salt. The venison needed another hour, at least. "You're already adjusting the stock." The voice came from behind her, dry and faintly irritated. Maisie did not startle. She had heard the footsteps 2 corridors away. Old stone carried sound better than people realized. She turned to find Petra, the estate steward, standing in the doorway with a ledger pressed to her chest and an expression that suggested the morning had already disappointed her significantly. Petra was a sharp woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled into a severe knot and eyes the color of river stones. She was also, Maisie had learned, the kind of person whose criticism meant she was paying attention. "The stock needed adjusting," Maisie said simply. "The feast is in 11 hours. Which is why I'm adjusting it now, instead of then." Petra's mouth pressed flat. She stepped into the kitchen, moving around the preparation tables with the air of someone inspecting for hidden failures. She lifted a cloth cover from a tray of spiced pastry rounds, examined them, set the cloth back without comment. That, in Petra's language, was approval. "The Alpha King's party will arrive by midday," Petra said. "They ride from the north, so they will be cold and hungry. The king himself does not eat in public very often. I need you to understand what that means. It means when he does eat, it has to be worth it," Maisie said. Petra looked at her for a moment, a long, measuring look. "You're not afraid of today, are you?" It was not quite a question. Maisie thought about the honest answer. She was not afraid of cooking. She was not afraid of powerful people eating her food. What she carried in her chest was something quieter and more complicated than fear. But that was not Petra's business. "I'll be in the kitchen," Maisie said. "That's enough." Petra left without pushing further. The kitchen returned to its comfortable rhythm of crackling fire and simmering pots. By mid-morning, the other kitchen workers had arrived, 4 young women from the village and an older man named Holt, who handled the heavier lifting and never spoke unless spoken to. Maisie liked Holt enormously. She set them each to their tasks with brief, clear instructions, and the kitchen moved like a well-tuned instrument. She was deboning a second cut of venison when she heard the horns, low and resonant, rolling through the cold air from the main gates. 3 long calls. The Alpha King's signal. Around her, the kitchen girls paused in their work. One of them, the youngest, barely 17, with wide eyes and flour on her nose, pressed herself toward the small window above the wash basin, craning her neck. "Can you see anything?" another whispered. "Riders," the girl breathed. "So many riders. And the banner. It's black with a silver wolf." "Back to your stations," Maisie said. Not harshly, just clearly. They returned to work, though the energy in the kitchen had shifted. Even the fire seemed to lean toward the sounds coming from outside. Maisie did not go to the window. She finished the venison, wrapped it in herb-soaked cloth, and set it near the heat. Then she wiped her hands on her apron and began on the next task. She did not need to see the Alpha King. She only needed to feed him. That conviction lasted until just past midday, when Petra appeared again in the kitchen doorway, this time with color high in her cheeks and an expression Maisie had not seen on her before. "There is a problem," Petra said. The problem, as it turned out, was not with the food. The wedding was between Lady Soren, the estate holder's eldest daughter, and a young lord from a neighboring territory, a political arrangement dressed in celebration. It had been planned for months. Every detail had been arranged with careful precision. Except that Lady Soren, Petra informed Maisie in a low and carefully controlled voice, had been found that morning in the company of someone who was very much not her intended. And the intended, upon learning of this, had ridden back the way he had come before the Alpha King's party had even crossed the main gate. There was no wedding. There was, however, a feast already prepared. And a king already arrived. "He's been escorted to the Great Hall," Petra said. "Lord Fenwick is attempting to manage the situation, but the king will want to eat. And he will want to know why he rode 3 days north to a celebration that no longer exists." She paused. "Maisie, I need you to keep the kitchen going as though nothing has changed. The food must still be served. It's the only thing we can offer him." Maisie absorbed this. Then she nodded once and turned back to the fire. The feast was served in 2 stages, as tradition required. First a tasting arrangement of smaller dishes, then the main courses. Maisie supervised the plating herself, watching each dish leave the kitchen with the focus she usually reserved for the most delicate preparations. Whatever chaos lived in the Great Hall, it would not come from her end of the estate. She did not expect to be summoned. The message came through one of the younger servers, a boy with nervous eyes and a slight stammer. He delivered it word for word, as he had clearly been instructed. "The Alpha King requests the cook present herself." The kitchen went very still. Maisie set down the ladle in her hand. She looked at the boy. "Did he say why?" The boy swallowed. "No, miss. Only that it was not a request that would be repeated." She untied her apron, straightened the cloth wrap in her hair, looked down at her flour-dusted dress, her cracked boot, her rough hands still carrying the faint scent of herbs and wood smoke. There was nothing to be done about any of it. "Watch the pots," she told Holt. He gave her a short nod. She walked out of the kitchen and into the great hall, and the noise of 100 voices fell strangely quiet as she stepped through the doorway. The hall was full. Pack members, estate nobles, riders still in their travel cloaks. Candles burned in great iron holders along the walls, and the long tables were laden with the food she had prepared. The smell of it filled the space warmly, cutting through the cold that had leaked in from outside. At the head of the longest table sat a man she recognized only by the weight of the attention around him. He was younger than she had imagined. Not young, perhaps in his early 30s. But there was nothing of the withered authority she had half expected. He sat without ceremony, his dark riding clothes still carrying the dust of the road, a cup of water untouched at his right hand. His eyes were the light, sharp gray of winter sky just before snow. And those eyes were on her. She walked toward the table with the same steadiness she brought to every kitchen task. She stopped at a respectful distance and met his gaze without looking away, because she had learned long ago that looking away invited certain kinds of attention she did not want. "You made this food," he said. His voice was level, carrying easily across the quiet. "I did. Sit down." She had not expected that. Around the table she saw faces shift, surprise, confusion, something sharper in the expressions of those who understood hierarchy well enough to know that what was happening was unusual. Alpha King Cassian did not look at any of them. He looked at her. "I said sit down," he repeated, not unkindly. "You've been standing over a fire since before sunrise. The least I can offer you is a chair." Maisie stood very still for one long moment. Then she sat. The chair was solid oak, worn smooth at the arms from years of use. Maisie sat in it the way she sat in most things, straight-backed, hands folded in her lap, taking up as little space as possible. Around her, the great hall had resumed its noise gradually, like water filling back into a disturbed pool. Conversations restarted. Cups were lifted. But she could feel the glances, brief and sharp as needles, coming from every direction. She was a cook sitting at the Alpha King's table. That was not a thing that happened. Cassian had returned his attention to the food, and for a moment, Maisie studied him the way she studied a new kitchen, carefully, without making it obvious. He ate with deliberate attention, the way people did when they were actually tasting, rather than simply consuming. He tried the root soup first, then the braised greens with smoked salt, then a portion of the venison. He did not speak while he ate. He did not perform satisfaction for the room. When he set down his fork, he turned to her again. "The soup," he said. "What's in it that shouldn't be there?" Maisie blinked. "I'm not sure I understand the question. Every cook has one ingredient they add that isn't in any recipe. Something personal." He studied her with those pale gray eyes. "The soup tastes like a decision. I want to know what it was." She was quiet for a moment. Around them, the nearest conversations had lowered in volume, which meant they were being listened to. She decided not to care about that. "Roasted pine bark," she said. "Just a small piece, added at the beginning and removed before serving. It gives the broth a depth that dried herbs can't reach. Most people can't identify it. They only know the soup tastes like something they've had before but can't name." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something more interior than that. "Where did you learn that?" "From a woman in the eastern mountains. She was very old and very particular about her fire, and she taught me that the best flavors in cooking come from things you're not supposed to use." Maisie paused. "She also taught me that sharing the trick ruins the effect, so I'd appreciate your discretion." This time, the corner of his mouth did move. "You have my word." The exchange lasted perhaps 2 minutes in total. Then Lord Fennec materialized at Cassian's left shoulder, a broad, anxious man whose formal collar seemed to be slowly strangling him, and bent to murmur something urgent into the king's ear. Cassian's expression returned to its neutral stillness. He nodded once. "You're dismissed," he said to Maisie. Then, as she began to rise, he added without looking up, "The venison was the best I've eaten in 4 years. Tell no one I said that. It will ruin my reputation for indifference." She left the table and walked back to the kitchen, and it was only when the door swung shut behind her and the familiar heat of the fire met her face that she realized her hands were not entirely steady. She gripped the edge of the preparation table and breathed. Holt looked at her from across the kitchen. He said nothing, which was one of his greatest qualities. "The venison was well received," she said, to no one in particular. Said Holt. She went back to work. The evening stretched long. Feasts without celebrations had a particular quality. The food and wine did their work, but the joy underneath was hollow, and people drank more than they should to fill the gap. Maisie kept the kitchen running through 3 additional rounds of bread and 2 emergency preparations of spiced cider when it became clear that warmth was what the room needed most. She was scrubbing the last of the large pots when Petra returned, closing the kitchen door behind her with the careful quiet of someone carrying difficult information. "He's staying," Petra said. Maisie turned from the pot. "The king. 3 days, at minimum, possibly more." Petra set her ledger on the nearest table and pressed her fingers to her temples. "The situation with Lady Soren has created a political complication that apparently requires his direct attention. Lord Fenwick is beside himself." She exhaled. "I need to know if you can manage the kitchen for the duration." "Yes." "It won't be a celebration feast. It will be regular meals. Morning, midday, evening. For the king's party. 14 riders, 2 advisors, and himself." "I can manage that." Petra looked at her steadily. "He asked about you." The pot in Maisie's hands was very cold now. She set it down carefully. "What did he ask?" "Your name, where you came from, whether you were attached to the estate permanently or brought in for the occasion." Petra's tone was neutral, professional, revealing nothing of her own interpretation. "I told him you were contracted for the wedding preparations and that your arrangement was temporary. And," he said to extend it. Petra picked up her ledger. "Whatever that means, it means you're here for at least 3 more days. I'll have a proper room prepared for you in the staff quarters. You've been sleeping in the prep room, and I won't have a head cook with a crick in her neck trying to manage a royal party's meals." She left before Maisie could respond. The kitchen was quiet. The fire had burned down to steady coals. Outside, through the high narrow window, the sky had gone the deep indigo of late evening, and the first cold stars were appearing. Maisie stood alone in the kitchen she had been commanding since before dawn, and tried to understand what she felt. "Careful," said something in her chest. "Be careful." She had learned, through years of working in other people's households, that attention from powerful people was not a simple thing. It could mean many things, and most of them required something from you that you hadn't agreed to give. She had built her life on being useful, reliable, and unremarkable. The kind of woman who kept the fire going, and the food coming, and whose name was known only in the context of what she produced. She did not know what to do with a king who asked about pine bark. Her room in the staff quarters was small and clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single candle on the windowsill. After the long day, it felt like a palace. She sat on the edge of the bed and unwrapped the cloth from her hair, and let herself be still for a moment. Her name was Maisie Calloway. She was 24 years old. She had been cooking professionally since she was 16, first in a village inn, then in a series of larger households, each one a step further from the place she had grown up. A small holding in the eastern hills, where her mother had run a modest kitchen, and her father had been, as far as anyone knew, not present enough to matter. She did not talk about her past, not because it was dramatic or shameful, but because it was hers. And she had learned that the moment you gave people pieces of your history, they began to build a version of you from those pieces that had very little to do with who you actually were. She was a cook. That was clean and simple and true. She blew out the candle and lay down in her clothes, because the room was cold and the blanket was thin, and she was tired in the particular way that came from spending a full day being precisely what everyone needed you to be. She was nearly asleep when she heard it. Voices in the corridor outside her room. Low but heated, the specific register of an argument being conducted by people who did not want to be overheard. She recognized one voice as belonging to one of Cassian's advisors, a narrow-faced man named Drest who had watched her walk to the king's table with an expression she had not liked. "Can't simply seat a kitchen woman at the table without explanation," Drest was saying. The pack representatives were watching. "It sends a message." "The message," came another voice, quieter and harder to identify, "is that he'll do as he chooses, which has always been the message." There are 3 noble families here tonight who came expecting to see him make an alliance, and instead, he spent 2 minutes talking to a cook about soup. Keep your voice down. A pause. Footsteps. Then silence. Maisie stared at the ceiling in the dark. 3 noble families, an alliance, and a king who had, apparently, disrupted the evening's political undercurrents by asking her to sit down and tell him about pine bark. She thought about Petra's expression when she'd said he asked about you. She thought about the way he had looked at her across the table, not with the assessment of a man evaluating a woman's appearance, but with the sharp, specific attention of someone trying to understand something they had not expected. She closed her eyes. "Be careful," said that voice in her chest again. But underneath it, quieter and more troubling, said something else entirely. He remembered the soup. Morning came gray and heavy, with low clouds pressing down over the estate like a lid on a pot. Maisie was in the kitchen before the first bell, coaxing the fire back from embers, listening to the wind find the gaps in the old stone walls. She had slept poorly, which she attributed to the unfamiliar bed and not to any other cause, and she moved through the early preparations with the particular focused energy of someone determined not to think. Breakfast for 17 people. She could do that in her sleep. She was arranging a tray of warm rolls when the kitchen door opened, and someone walked in who was not Holt, not Petra, and not any of the village girls. She knew before she turned around. The quality of footstep was different, heavier, more deliberate, carrying the kind of certainty that did not announce itself. Cassian stood in the doorway of her kitchen. He was dressed more simply than the night before. A dark wool tunic, riding trousers, boots that had seen real use. No formal insignia, no ceremonial weight. He looked, in the gray morning light, like a man who had been awake for some time and had made peace with that fact. Maisie turned fully to face him. "The morning meal will be sent to the hall within the hour." "I know," he said. "I'm not here for the meal." She waited. He stepped into the kitchen with a glance around that was more curious than inspecting, taking in the hanging herbs, the organized preparation tables, the small clay pots arranged by size along the back shelf. "You've reorganized this kitchen." "It was organized for storing, not for cooking," she said. "I moved things to where they're actually needed." "How long did that take you?" "About 40 minutes yesterday morning, before anyone else arrived." He looked at her then. "You came in early enough to reorganize a kitchen before the rest of the staff arrived. The fire needed lighting anyway." Something in his expression shifted. Not quite the interior movement she had seen the night before, but adjacent to it. He pulled out the stool near the far preparation table, the one Holt usually occupied, and sat down with the ease of a man who had decided he was staying. Maisie looked at him for a moment. Then she turned back to the rolls. "You can stay," she said, "but I'm going to keep working." I expected nothing less. She worked. He watched. It should have been uncomfortable. A king sitting on a kitchen stool while a cook prepared breakfast. But the silence between them had a texture that was not hostile, not weighted with performance. He was not watching her the way people watch someone they were evaluating. He was watching the way people watch something that interested them. After a few minutes, he spoke. "How long have you been a cook?" 8 years professionally. Before that, my mother's kitchen since I was old enough to reach the table. "You don't have pack affiliation." It was stated, not asked. She kept her hands moving. "No." "That's unusual for someone with your skill. Most cooks of your caliber are attached to a pack house or a noble estate by now." "I prefer contracts," she said. "They have clear beginnings and endings." A pause. "And you prefer things that end clearly." She glanced at him sideways. He was not smiling, but there was a quality of attention in his expression that told her he had heard more in that sentence than she had necessarily intended to give him. "I prefer clarity in general," she said carefully. He accepted that without pushing. She gave him credit for it. "The feast last night," he said, after another stretch of comfortable silence. "You prepared it knowing the wedding had fallen apart." "Petra told me to keep the kitchen running, so I did." Most people in that situation would have been distracted, worried about the consequences. The food would have suffered. "The food isn't responsible for the wedding," Maisie said simply. "It's only responsible for being good. Those are separate concerns." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's a remarkably sane way to think about it." Most sane thinking looks remarkable when you're surrounded by panic. This time, the corner of his mouth did move, and it stayed moved for longer than the night before. She noted this and returned her attention firmly to the breakfast tray. He left before the kitchen staff arrived, rising from the stool with the same unhurried certainty with which he had entered. At the door, he paused. "The cider last night," he said. "That was also you." "Yes." It was the right call. The room needed warmth more than wine. She looked at him across the kitchen. "I know." He left. The door swung closed on the cold corridor smell of stone and pine. Maisie stood still for exactly 3 seconds. Then she went back to work. Drest arrived in the kitchen at mid-morning, while Maisie was directing the preparation of a midday meal. He came alone, without the other advisor, and he closed the door behind him in a way that was designed to feel significant. He was a thin man, perhaps 50, with the careful grooming of someone who understood that appearance was a form of argument. He wore the king's insignia on his collar, a small silver wolf's head, and he held his hands clasped in front of him in a posture that suggested patience, while radiating something closer to calculation. "Maisie Calloway," he said. "I'm in the middle of something," she said, without looking up from the sauce she was reducing. "I won't take much of your time." He stepped closer, keeping to the edge of the kitchen, away from the working area. She noted that he had enough awareness not to enter her space directly. "I want to speak with you about the king. I'm a cook. I make his food. That's the extent of our connection." "Currently," Drest said, with a particular emphasis on the word that she did not like. "I want to ensure that remains the case." She set down her spoon and turned to face him fully. Around them, the kitchen girls had gone very quiet, moving carefully through their tasks with the concentrated expressions of people pretending not to listen. "Explain what you mean," she said. "The king is here for a purpose that has nothing to do with feasts or cookery," Drest said. His voice was smooth and measured, the voice of a man who had practiced difficult conversations. "He came to observe a political alliance. That alliance failed spectacularly, and now he is managing a delicate situation involving 3 noble families whose cooperation he needs. His attention should be on that." A pause. "Not on kitchen staff." Maisie held his gaze. "I haven't sought the king's attention." "No, but you haven't discouraged it either." "A man of his position walks into my kitchen before dawn and sits on a stool," she said evenly. "What exactly would you have me do? Refuse him entry to a room he owns?" Drest's mouth thinned. "I would have you understand the nature of your position here. You are a temporary contract worker. The feast is over. Your usefulness, beyond the next few days of basic meals, is limited." He paused again, and the pause was calculated. "I would hate for you to mistake courtesy for something more significant and find yourself disappointed." The word landed with a specific weight. She understood what he was doing, not threatening her directly, but placing doubt, the kind that burrowed quietly and did its work from the inside. She picked up her spoon again. "The sauce will burn if I leave it longer. Is there anything else?" He looked at her for a moment, reassessing, she could tell, whether she had understood. She had understood perfectly. That was not the same as being affected. No, he said. That was all. He left. Holt, from his corner of the kitchen, did not look up from the bread dough he was working, but he pressed it slightly harder than necessary, and Maisie found that quietly comforting. She stirred the sauce and thought about what Drest had not said directly, but had made very clear. Someone was watching. Someone had decided she was a variable that needed managing. And in her experience, people who felt the need to manage variables were people who were worried about what those variables might reveal. The question was, what did Drest think she might reveal? She was still turning this over when one of the kitchen girls, the youngest one, the wide-eyed one who had pressed to the window to see the riders, appeared at her elbow with a folded piece of paper. "A man left this for you at the kitchen door," the girl said. "He didn't give a name." Maisie unfolded the paper. The handwriting was plain and direct. Clearly someone more accustomed to action than correspondence. "There are things about this estate you should know before you decide to stay longer. Meet me at the wood store at second bell if you want the truth. If you don't come, I'll know you already know." She folded the paper and slipped it into her apron pocket. Second bell was 2 hours away. She returned to the sauce, and the kitchen moved around her in its steady rhythm. And outside the windows, the gray clouds had begun to release the first thin needles of cold rain. The rain had thickened by the time second bell rang through the estate, a low tone that traveled through stone and timber and settled in the chest like a warning. Maisie dried her hands on a clean cloth, told Holt she was stepping out for air, and walked into the cold. The wood store was at the back of the estate, past the stable yard and behind a low stone wall that separated the working areas from the formal grounds. It was a practical building, rough-hewn timber walls, a wide overhang to keep the split logs dry, smelling of pine sap and damp bark, and the particular cold sharpness of wet stone. Maisie pulled her shawl tighter and stepped under the overhang. A man was already there. He was perhaps 30, broad through the shoulders, with the look of someone who had spent more time outdoors than in. He wore a rider's cloak, plain and dark, and his expression when he turned to face her was the expression of someone who had not fully decided whether this meeting was a good idea. "You came," he said. "I almost didn't," she said honestly. "Anonymous notes are either brave or foolish, and I hadn't decided which. Probably both." He shifted his weight. "My name is Rowan. I ride with the King's party, 3rd position. Which means I'm close enough to see everything and unimportant enough that people forget I'm watching." "And what have you been watching?" He looked at her directly. His eyes were brown and serious, carrying the weight of someone who had been holding something too long. "You need to understand something about why we're actually here. And I mean the real reason, not the version Lord Fenwick has been told." Maisie leaned against the nearest stack of logs and gave him her full attention. Rowan spoke carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone who had rehearsed, and then decided to abandon the rehearsal. The Alpha King, he explained, had received intelligence 3 weeks prior, suggesting that a network of packed territories in the northern region had been systematically undermined. Resources redirected, loyalties quietly purchased, records altered. The wedding between Lady Soren and the Northern Lord had been, from the beginning, a potential piece of that network. An alliance that would have given certain parties control over a key trade route, and more importantly, a strategic position that overlooked 4 packed territories simultaneously. "The wedding falling apart wasn't an accident," Rowan said. "Lady Soren didn't stumble into that situation. She was put there." Maisie was quiet for a moment. "By whom?" "That's what the King is here to determine." Rowan's jaw tightened. "And here's what concerns me about you specifically. Drest came to see you this morning." She kept her expression neutral. "You were watching. I told you. That's my function." He stepped closer, lowering his voice despite the empty yard around them. "Drest is not who he appears to be. He has served the King for 6 years, and in that time has positioned himself as indispensable. He manages correspondence, schedules, and, critically, who gets access to the king and who doesn't. A pause. He also has connections to the northern network that the king does not yet know about. The rain tapped steadily on the overhang above them. Somewhere in the stable yard, a horse shifted and blew. "Why are you telling me this?" Maisie asked. "Because Drest came to warn you away from the king, and that means he sees you as a threat to something." Rowan met her eyes. "You've been working in this estate for 2 weeks preparing for this wedding. You've been in the kitchens, the supply corridors, the storage rooms. People talk around kitchen staff the way they talk around furniture. They forget you're listening." "I wasn't listening to anything in particular. Maybe not consciously." He reached into his cloak and produced a small folded document, which he held out to her without releasing it. 3 days ago, before the king's party arrived, a supply delivery came to this estate. Unusual quantities, more than a wedding would require. Some items were redirected to a storage room that isn't on the estate's official inventory. I believe you walked past that room. She thought back. The eastern corridor, past the wine storage. A door she had noted because it was newer than the surrounding stonework, hinges that didn't match, a lock that looked recently fitted. She had thought nothing of it because it was none of her business. "There's a room with a new door," she said slowly. "Eastern corridor, below the guest quarters." Something shifted in Rowan's expression. Relief, and something sharper underneath it. "Did you see what was inside?" "The door was locked. I wasn't trying to see inside. I just noticed it didn't belong." He nodded once, slowly. "That's enough. That's actually enough." He tucked the document back inside his cloak. "I need you to tell the king what you just told me. Not me, him, directly. Drest manages every formal communication channel, which means I can't put this in writing without risking it being intercepted. But you—" "I'm a cook," she said. "I have no formal communication channels. I'm not part of any structure he can intercept." "Exactly." She looked at him for a long moment. The rain was heavier now, drumming the overhang, filling the air with the cold, clean smell of wet earth and pine. Her boots were getting damp through the cracked left sole. "If Drest is what you say he is," she said carefully, "and he already sees me as a variable he wants removed, going to the king with this information makes me considerably more visible." "Yes," Rowan said. He did not try to soften it. "It does. And if I say nothing, I finish my contract, I leave in 3 days, and whatever is happening here continues without me. Also, yes." She looked at the rain. "You're not making a very persuasive argument." "I'm not trying to persuade you," he said quietly. "I'm trying to give you the truth and let you choose. Persuasion is what Drest does. I'm done with that particular tool." She stood in the shelter of the wood store for another minute, listening to the rain, feeling the cold work its way through her shawl and settle against her shoulders. Then she pushed off from the log stack and straightened. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's all I'm asking." She walked back through the rain to the kitchen. She thought about it through the preparation of the midday meal and through the quiet of the early afternoon, while the estate settled into the gray lull that heavy rain produced. She thought about Drest's careful, pointed words. "I would hate for you to mistake courtesy for something more significant." She thought about the new door in the eastern corridor and what it meant that she had noticed it and said nothing, because it was not, technically, her concern. She thought about her mother's kitchen in the eastern hills, and about the woman in the mountains who had taught her about pine bark, and about every household she had ever worked in where something was wrong, and the kitchen staff had known first, and said nothing because saying something was not, technically, their function. She was slicing dried apples for a late afternoon dish when Cassian walked into the kitchen again. This time, he was not alone. He had Rowan with him, which told her that Rowan had made a different calculation about how much time they had. Cassian's expression was different from the morning. The quiet curiosity was still present, but underneath it was something more focused, a directed attention that she recognized as the version of him that was not simply a man sitting on a stool watching someone cook. He closed the door. "Rowan tells me he spoke with you this morning," he said. "At the wood store, yes. He also tells me you noticed something in the eastern corridor." She set down the knife, turned to face them both. Rowan stood slightly behind and to the left of the king, his expression carefully composed into something that was not quite apology and not quite hope. She described the door, the new hinges, the mismatched lock, the way it sat slightly wrong against the older stonework. She described the delivery she had seen 3 days prior, crates that had come in through the kitchen service entrance at an unusual hour, carried by men she had not recognized, directed by someone she had only glimpsed from behind, and whose build she described as precisely as she could. Cassian listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The build you described," he said. "The man directing the delivery, yes. Could it have been dressed?" She thought back to that corridor, to the figure she had seen from 20 feet away in poor light, directing workers in a low and certain voice, the set of the shoulders, the clasped hands. "I can't say for certain," she said honestly, "but it could have been." Cassian looked at her for a long moment, that winter sky gaze, reading something in her face with a precision that she found both uncomfortable and, unexpectedly, reassuring. He was not trying to manipulate her toward a particular answer. He was simply listening to what she actually said. "You could have said nothing," he said. "I know." "Why didn't you?" She picked up the knife again and looked at the apples. "Because the door didn't belong there, and things that don't belong somewhere are usually someone's secret." She paused. "And I've never been comfortable keeping other people's secrets for them, especially when those secrets have locks on them." The kitchen was very quiet. The rain moved across the high, narrow window in gray sheets. Then Cassian said, in a voice that was completely level and somehow more serious than anything that had preceded it, "Maisie, I need you to understand that what you've just told me changes the nature of the next 3 days considerably, for everyone in this estate, including you." She looked up from the apples. "I know," she said again. Something passed through his expression, something that was not quite relief, not quite respect, but carried elements of both. "I'll need you to keep doing what you do," he said. "Go to the kitchen, cook the meals. Be exactly what everyone in this estate believes you are." He paused. "Can you do that?" "I've been doing it my entire life," she said. The next morning arrived with frost. It coated the window panes of the kitchen in thin white lace and turned the stone floors colder than usual, and Maisie lit the fire with the particular urgency that frost demanded, not just for warmth, but because cold kitchens produced flat bread and cloudy stock, and a general sluggishness in the food that experienced palates detected immediately. She fed the fire until it roared properly, then set the stock pot and began. She moved through the morning preparations with the same surface calm she had maintained for 2 days, but underneath it, her attention had sharpened into something entirely different. She noted who came to the kitchen door and when. She listened to the conversations that drifted in from the corridor. She watched the pattern of movement in the estate, the way she had once watched an unfamiliar kitchen, learning where things were held, where pressure built, where the system was likely to break. Drest came to the kitchen once that morning, not to speak with her but to collect a written inventory list that Petra had left at the service entrance. He did not look at Maisie directly. That, she noted, was new. The previous morning he had looked at her with the measured assessment of someone conducting a calculation. Now he looked at the floor near her feet, which was a different kind of calculation entirely. He was managing distance. That meant he was managing something he was afraid of. She filed this away and continued chopping. The estate had a particular rhythm that Maisie had mapped instinctively over the days she'd been there. Lord Fenwick met with his advisors at mid-morning. The noble family representatives, there were 3 households staying in the guest quarters, took their midday meal separately from the king's party and from the estate's regular staff. Lady Soren had not appeared publicly since the failed wedding, confined to her rooms by what the estate staff described in careful whispers as illness, though the kitchen girl with wide eyes had told Maisie quietly that she had heard weeping through the corridor wall 2 nights running. Maisie did not discuss Lady Soren, but she sent up a tray with the midday meal that included a small pot of honey and chamomile tea that had not been requested, and the tray came back empty. Some things could be communicated without words. It was mid-afternoon when Rowan appeared at the kitchen door, and Maisie knew from the set of his jaw that something had moved faster than expected. "Tonight," he said quietly, stepping just inside the door. "Cassian is going to inspect the eastern corridor." "How?" "Fenwick has been asked to arrange a formal review of the estate's storage and supply records. A standard administrative process." Rowan's voice was low and steady. "It gives Cassian access to that corridor without signaling that he's looking for anything specific. Drest will be occupied with the documentation review, which keeps him away from that end of the estate. And if the room is empty, if whatever was in those crates has already been moved, then we learn that it's been moved, which tells us something too." He looked at her steadily. "I wanted you to know. You gave us the information that made this possible." She dried her hands on her apron. "I gave you a description of a door. You gave us something to look for when we didn't know we were missing it." He paused at the door. "Stay in the kitchen tonight if anything sounds unusual. Don't investigate. Don't come to that corridor." "I wasn't planning to." "Good." He started to leave, then turned back. "He trusts your judgment. I want you to know that. It's not a thing he gives easily or quickly." Then he was gone, back into the cold corridor, and Maisie stood in her kitchen with the fire at her back and the frost still clinging to the high window and something shifting quietly in her chest that she did not have a clean name for. Evening came early, as it did in late autumn, pulling darkness over the estate, while the kitchen lights burned warm and yellow against the cold. Maisie prepared the evening meal with full attention, working through every dish with the precision that difficult days demanded. Roasted turnips with herb butter, a lentil and smoked pork broth, fresh bread with a dark, dense crumb that held heat well. Practical food, the kind that settled people and gave them steadiness. She was plating the last of the bread when she heard it. Not a shout, not the dramatic crash of confrontation. Simply a change in the quality of sound from the far end of the estate. A shift in the air that anyone less attuned to their surroundings would have missed entirely. Footsteps that were too rapid. A door that closed with more force than necessary. Then voices, several at once, overlapping, coming from somewhere past the great hall. She set down the bread. Holt looked at her from across the kitchen. His expression was the expression of a man who had learned a long time ago that the worst things that happened in big houses happened quietly, and that the best response was to keep your hands busy and your head down. She picked the bread back up, finished plating it, arranged the tray. 20 minutes later, Petra came to the kitchen. Her face was composed with the effortful stillness of someone managing a significant internal event. "The evening meal can be delayed by half an hour," Petra said. "There's been a development." "Should I keep things warm?" "Yes." A pause. "Maisie, whatever happens in the next hour, I want you to know that you have conducted yourself with complete professionalism throughout your time here. Whatever is said about your involvement in any of this, I will speak to that clearly." Maisie looked at her. "What's being said about my involvement?" Petra's expression shifted, a flicker of something that might have been anger, quickly controlled. "Drest has suggested to Lord Fenwick that you were used as an informant against the estate's interests, that you were recruited by the king's party prior to your arrival here, as part of a scheme to investigate the estate, under cover of the wedding preparations." The kitchen was very still. "That's not true," Maisie said. "I know that." Petra's voice was firm. "And the king knows that. but Dressed is attempting to reframe the situation before it can be framed around him. She straightened. "Half an hour. Keep things warm." She left. Maisie turned back to the fire. She placed her hands flat on the warm stone of the hearth surround and felt the heat against her palms and thought very carefully about what she knew and what she could not control. She had noticed a door. She had described a delivery. She had answered questions honestly. That was the full extent of what she had done, and it was also, apparently, enough to make her the simplest available target in a complicated situation. This was the part of powerful people's business that she had always known, in the back of her mind, existed. The part where someone like her, no pack, no family, no political protection, became a useful piece to move on someone else's board. She thought about Rowan's words. "He trusts your judgment." She thought about Cassian sitting on a kitchen stool asking about pine bark. She thought about a man who ate with attention and listened without interrupting, and had given her his word about a small kitchen secret. Then she untied her apron, folded it over the preparation table, and walked out of the kitchen. She did not go to the eastern corridor. She went to the great hall. It was not the dramatic confrontation she might have imagined in a different story. The great hall held perhaps 20 people. Cassian's riders, Lord Fenwick in a state of visible distress, the 3 noble family representatives in varying postures of wariness, and Dressed, standing near the far wall with the careful composure of a man who had prepared for this and was not yet sure if his preparation was adequate. Rowan was there. He saw her first, and his expression shifted from surprise to something that was not quite relief. Cassian saw her a moment later. He was standing at the center of the room with 2 of his senior riders, holding a document she recognized as a supply manifest. His expression, when he looked at her, was the stillest she had seen it. The winter sky gaze fully present, reading the room and her position in it simultaneously. She crossed the hall and stopped in front of him. Around them, conversations quieted. "I heard that my involvement is being characterized inaccurately," she said. Her voice was steady. "I thought it should be characterized by me directly, rather than by someone who wasn't present for any of it." Dressed's voice came from across the room. "This is highly irregular. So is planting a false narrative about a contracted kitchen worker," Cassian said, without looking away from Maisie. His voice carried the particular quality of authority that did not raise itself to be heard. It simply occupied the room completely. "Continue," he said to her. She told the room what she had told him privately. The delivery. The door. The honest uncertainty about the figure she had seen directing the workers. She did not embellish. She did not protect herself with extra words. She said exactly what she knew, and exactly where her certainty ended. When she finished, the hall was quiet. Dressed spoke. His voice had lost some of its careful smoothness. "The woman has been manipulated by..." "The manifest," Cassian said, holding up the document. "Lists 43 crates of supply materials delivered to this estate 3 days ago. The estate's official inventory accounts for 31 of them." He set the document on the nearest table. The remaining 12 crates were directed to a storage room that does not appear in any official record of this estate. A room with a new door and a recently fitted lock. He looked at Dressed now, and the quality of his attention was entirely different from how he had looked at Maisie. "You signed the secondary delivery order. Your name, your seal." The silence in the hall was the particular silence of a thing being understood all at once by many people simultaneously. Dressed looked at Maisie, and in his eyes, behind the composure, was something she recognized, the specific expression of a person who had underestimated the wrong variable. She met his gaze without satisfaction and without fear. She was a cook. She had noticed a door. The rest had been true all along, simply waiting for the right light to show it clearly.